Greetings. We're continuing to look at some of the gospel stories from Mark's gospel. Today, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. In our previous session, we were at the end of chapter 4, where Jesus stilled the storm on Lake Galilee. And that was while they were doing a journey from the very Jewish corner, which he was more familiar with and where most of the gospel stories tend to happen, the top left, northwest corner of the lake, Capernaum, Magdala, all that area. And at the end of chapter 4, they're moving across the lake and we'll come to the country of the Gadarenes, or of the Decapolis, that is the 10 cities, an area which was much more Greek-speaking, much more Gentile. Today, largely part of the Golan Heights, disputed area claimed by Israel, but also by Syria and so on. Jesus spends the first half of chapter 5 in that area, and then by verse 21, where we begin today, he has crossed again in the boat to the other side. That is, to the side where he was best known and most of his ministry took place, the area where most of today's pilgrims or tourists would go or would have gone before the current dreadful situation in the Holy Land. He's crossed again in the boat to the other side, chapter 5, verse 21. A great crowd gathers around him, and he's by the lake. That's what happens when he's on home territory, the Capernaum side of the lake. A great crowd gathers. And one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus, came and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter's at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so she may be made well and live." And he went with him. He's fallen at his feet. This is a synagogue ruler. He is an important person in society. The synagogues in these towns didn't have resident rabbis. That was something for Jerusalem. They entertained and listened to visiting traveling rabbis and others who would bring a word or whatever. But the life of the worshipping community is governed and led by the synagogue leader, in this case Jairus. He would be well known, his name would be well known. He would be in charge of the synagogue building and of its communal life, and he would ensure that there was someone to open up the scriptures, to lead worship, and so on. He was something like an elder in a free church that doesn't have a minister, or in Anglican terms, perhaps a church warden in a church which doesn't have a rector or vicar, someone who's responsible for keeping it going, and who therefore is a leader in the community. And he has fallen at Jesus' feet and begged him to come and heal his daughter, with clearly some sense of confidence that he can. That in itself is a remarkable thing. But what's going to happen in the rest of the story, of course, is even more remarkable. We're about to be interrupted by one of the sandwiches from Mark's Gospel. Jairus and his daughter is the bread at the beginning and end of the sandwich, and in the middle is the meat or whatever of another problem, another person with a problem, someone else for Jesus to help. And we will see how that works. But do note that this is one of these sandwich stories. Typically in Mark, the heart of understanding is to be found in the in the middle part of the sandwich, but the whole thing is important, putting it mildly. And the whole thing hangs together. This is chronologically the order in which it happened, undoubtedly. The three events, Jairus asking for help, the interruption, and then Jairus's daughter being healed or raised. That's the order in which it happens. But Mark presents it and teaches it as a good writer, and we see some parallels and themes that come out with the two stories alongside each other, or the one embedded into the other. So Jesus sets off, verse 24, towards Jairus's house. A large crowd follows him and presses in on him. There's always a large crowd around Jesus, but they're ready for a bit of action here, looking forward to what's going to happen. Now, there was a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, verse 25. And Mark turns the language of this into something that's quite gripping and unusual grammar, and we're not doing it in English. But this list of what she'd been suffering and undergoing in verses 25 and 26 is extremely vivid in the original language. She's suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, enduring much under many physicians, spending all she has, getting no better, getting worse. It's odd grammar. We can't put it easily into English, but we certainly get the picture of what's going on. All these issues are active and they're continuing and they're getting no better. It's not she had done this and she had done that, but all these things are ongoing. She is suffering. She is enduring under physicians. She is spending all that she's had, and she is no better, and she is getting worse. It's a horrible story and situation. And of course, this means in the Jewish world that she is unclean. A synagogue ruler wouldn't be unclean. A synagogue ruler would be ritually clean and the sort of person who could talk to religious leaders and rabbis and people like Jesus, no problem. This woman, because of the nature of her complaint and that it involved blood, poor woman, she is ritually unclean, and she is therefore barred from worship in the synagogue. And that's a little bit of the irony in this story. Jesus is helping the family of synagogue leader, and he's interrupted by someone whose condition would exclude them from the synagogue. He is helping someone who is a leader of the community, and he's interrupted by someone who in their religious world was an outcast from the community. That's all part of the story. We need to understand that her affliction would have excluded her from the worshipping community. Those who, women, menstrual bleeding, had to cleanse themselves ritually after having a period before they could return to the worshipping community. That was the way it worked. And obviously she wasn't able to do that because the bleeding didn't stop. She'd heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. We don't know exactly where this happened, somewhere in that northwestern corner of the shore of the lake. There's a wonderful, more than life-size painting of this on the wall of a fairly new chapel that's been built in Magdala, where there's a huge amount of excavation and much being discovered about that ancient fishing port. There's a wonderful picture of the woman touching a hand touching the hem of the robe by the feet of someone. But what she's doing is absolutely barred. Touching Jesus or touching his clothes makes him ritually unclean. That doesn't bother Jesus a great deal. Other things, according to the over-harsh reading of Jewish religious leaders, other things make him ritually unclean too. But the clean man, Jairus, has knelt at Jesus' feet or fallen at Jesus' feet and begged him. Very proper and right and religious. The woman, in her utter despair, the unclean outcast, has actually come up and touched Jesus' clothes. Now, there's an occasion we're familiar with where Jesus touches someone suffering from leprosy, again ritually unclean and making himself so, except that he heals the man, of course. This is even worse. This is someone who's ritually unclean coming and touching Jesus, wanting to be healed anonymously, I suspect. Immediately, the hemorrhage stops. She felt in her body that she was healed. And immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned in the crowd, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples, "Look, you're being pressed in by a crowd. Everyone's touching everyone." But he knows. And he looks all round to see who's done it, and the woman comes in fear and trembling and falls before him and tells him the whole truth, the big story, the bleeding, 12 years, the physicians, the fact that she's spent all her money, it's getting worse, not better. She tells him the whole story. One of the very, very good writers about this says at this point, Jesus speaks a word and changes the world, because he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Changing the world, I think, is a lovely way of putting this, a powerful way. It's in that word, daughter. That's how he has addressed her. She was an exile from the community, and she's back. Jesus has brought her back by his word. Her touch has healed her. Jesus doesn't want her to go away anonymously healed. Jesus wants her to know that she's now back in the community among God's people. She's now a daughter of God. Just as this bigger story, the sandwich, is about Jairus's daughter being healed. Jairus, important man, religious leader. There's no doubt about his daughter being a daughter. No doubt about her being part of the community. There were doubts about this woman being part of the community. In fact, she was exiled from it. And Jesus says, "Daughter." He says a word and he changes the world. Restores her relationship with God and with the people of God. By his word, he brings about transformation. Then he says, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Well, they're being made well and the being healed has happened already, but he wants to do something bigger. Go in peace. You're now at peace with God, at peace with the community. You're back. You were dead, but you're alive. You're back. And so she is brought back from the death of exile from community to life by that word, daughter. And so he's going to have to return to another daughter who is in danger of death, or possibly even by this point dead. But we've seen that he can change the world. He can restore one who is dead to the community and the religious life, one who is exiled and outcast. With a word, he can bring her back as the daughter of God. And so he gets back to the original on-track message, having, of course, allowed himself to be interrupted with that very, very powerful meet in the story. While he's still speaking, verse 35, people come from Jairus' house to say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Overhearing what they said, Jesus says to the leader of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Now, Jairus had been believing, or sort of believing, trusting for some sort of miracle earlier on. He's reassuring him here. It's got worse, but carry on believing. Maybe a hint of, you've seen what I did to the woman. You see the power of God. You see the power of God to restore. You see the power of God to restore a daughter. Trust me. And he allows no one to follow except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, the three, if you like, core disciples who between them will make sure the story is told. We're told by very, very early historians that Peter was the main source for Mark's gospel, and that a lot of Mark's gospel is the recollections of Peter. Well, here's Peter being taken into the heart of what goes on next. They came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Almost certainly the professional mourners or wailing women who turned up when there was a death, and they would have been ready before, as the girl was clearly dying. And when the death starts, the wailing, which is part of the public grief in a very community-based world. Things don't happen in private, and most people are part of the community and not excluded. And grief and joy are public. A wedding feast will involve the whole community. A bereavement will involve the whole community in public mourning and grieving, and the wailing women are part of that culture. Come to the house, verse 39, when he's entered the house, he says, then why do you make a commotion and weep? Child is not dead, but sleeping, and they laugh at him. They know death. They're in a world where death happens, and they know what it looks like. When he says she's sleeping, of course he might mean she is sleeping and she's just deeply unconscious and you lot don't know the difference. But it's still no less of a healing miracle if that's the case. More likely, I think he means she's sleeping in the sense that she can be woken and is deeply asleep, but asleep in the hands of God. They laugh at him. He puts them outside and takes the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, went into where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said, Talitha cum, little girl, get up. Little girl, it's affectionate, dear girl, dear young one, get up. And immediately she got up and began to walk. She was 12 years of age. 12. The woman had been ill for 12 years, about. She was about 12 years of age. Mark is making a point. Jesus doesn't say 12 years woman, 12 years girl. But Mark wants to make that point for us, or Peter wants to make sure Mark knows about it and that we know about it. It's not long since he called the 12 apostles to make his new kingdom, as we will say with theological hindsight, the kingdom of God built on the foundation of the apostles, the 12 who Jesus calls, in the same way as the Old Testament people of God were built on the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's parallel between the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles in the Bible in various places, not least the book of Revelation, but elsewhere. And I rather think that the 12 here is symbolic, not to say it isn't true. People have this strange idea sometimes that John's gospel is full of symbolism and the others just tell the story. I come off it, pull the other one. Mark understands symbolism too. And 12 is one of a number of features linking these two stories. There's a 12ness here, 12 bringing healing to the woman after 12 years of suffering, 12 bringing new life to the girl after tragic death in childhood. 12 is Jesus in action, healing this broken world, bringing in the kingdom of God, the perfect kingdom, bring in the kingdom based on the 12 apostles who he's chosen as the foundation. She's 12 years of age, and they were overcome with amazement, not that she was 12 years of age, but that Jesus had raised her from the dead, his parents and these 3 apostle witnesses. He strictly ordered them, no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. We're not sure how much of that particular story leaks until the apostles report it post Jesus' resurrection. Some of his miracles certainly leaked out a great deal. This one, perhaps not. Perhaps Jairus and his wife are awed and thankful and see who Jesus is and follow his instruction. The whole event, the whole sandwich is utterly remarkable. And I think the people involved are awestruck. The woman received something she couldn't have imagined, being accepted as a daughter, being told that she's welcome back in the community, that whatever uncleanness or ritual unwelcome applied to her is cancelled, being told she's at peace with God. The woman has received that. And there's astonishment, but here with Jairus' daughter, also astonishment. He has to tell them to give her something to eat. She's up and about. She's been ill on a deathbed for we don't know how long. She's had nothing to eat for several days, I imagine. She needs building up again. She's been raised from the dead. She just treat her normally, look after her, feed her up. They're too awestruck to have thought of that. And Jesus gets practical. In the same way he gets practical with the woman. Get back into the worshipping community. You're at peace. Peace now. Peace with others. Peace with God. And so he says to the parents, you've got a lovely little girl there. Feed her. That's what children need when they've been ill. It's very practical. From Jesus, who's the Lord of life and death. Metaphorical death of the woman, excluding from community, everything going wrong, everything falling apart, the literal physical death of the little girl, the 12 years for both, the symbolism of the 12, the one who's very much part of the community and part of one of the leading families, and the one who is nothing and exiled from the community. And Jesus is there for both. And new life comes to both. New life comes to important people who will come to him, fall before him and seek his help and salvation. And new life comes to the unimportant people who are nothing and excluded, that come to him seeking his help. Jesus, the Lord of life and death for all people. Amen.